Every year, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute names the person or institution that has had the greatest impact, for good or ill, on Canadian public policy as Canada's PolicyMaker of the Year. 2019 was not defined by a Canadian political leader. In fact, as Charles Burton explains in our PolicyMaker of the Year cover story, the figure who has most influenced Canadian public policy is not even Canadian. We had to announce, to our great regret, that the PolicyMaker of the Year is Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping. Though his influence and his impact on public policy is hardly in the best interests of Canadians, few can deny that Xi Jinping has forced more policy responses on Canada than anyone else. Take, for instance, China's response to the lawful detainment of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou on a U.S. extradition request. Beijing's response was aggressive, grossly disproportionate, and unlawful. Perhaps most notably, China engaged in hostage diplomacy by effectively kidnapping Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor and resentencing convicted Canadian Robert Schellenberg to death on drug charges. Furthermore, China has also applied unjustified non-tariff barriers to Canadian agricultural exports like canola and pork. To their shame, Canadian business leaders and retired politicians have sung from Beijing's song sheet, advocating for Canada to abandon the rule of law and to return Ms. Meng to China. Indeed, China's sharp power influence over Canadian society has paralyzed much of our political class. These pressure tactics seem to have made Ottawa falter. Our government has yet to take a firm stance for Canadian interests in the face of this illegitimate campaign of vulgar bullying. As Burton explains, Xi's China has also managed to silence our self-described progressive government, despite mounting evidence of egregious human rights abuses on a vast scale, including the mass internment and cultural genocide of Muslim Uyghurs and Kazakhs, the repression of Tibetans, and the regime's brutal crackdown in Hong Kong, to mention just a few. Xi's power in Canada has often been subtle and indirect, exemplified by just such silence, when in other contexts one would have expected a loud and vigorous Canadian policy response. When Ottawa's normally yappy policy dog does not bark in response to Chinese provocation, it is usually because Xi has silenced it with a treat or, much more likely, a crude threat. From Chinese Communist Party united front work with the diaspora community to deep-seated economic entanglement and much more, Xi has been able to weave a web of influence over Canadian politics, public policy, and society. It is remarkable how China has been able to reach deep into Canadian society with little in the way of pushback from our policymakers and the general public. Perhaps the greatest threat of influence from Xi's China is the unresolved question of Huawei. If the Chinese telecom giant is permitted to supply the equipment for Canada's 5G network, it could be Xi's greatest achievement in shaping Canada's international and domestic policy, including our relationship with the United States and other allies, and the security and privacy of our citizens. The fact that our government has yet to ban Huawei from 5G is indicative of the kind of influence Xi has over our own sovereign decision-making. While it's not too late for Canada to stiffen its backbone and seize back the initiative on these important policy questions, the clock is ticking. Unless Ottawa does a significant about-face on our national approach to China, it is likely that Xi Jinping will be Canadian Policymaker of the Year for many years to come. To learn more about our choice for 2019 Policymaker of the Year, read the full issue of our latest Inside Policy magazine by clicking on the link below. I'm Brian Lee Crowley for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.